Are you curious about Gestalt language processing? You are not alone. Join me, Corinne Smoose, and speech therapy PD for our podcast, The Gestalt Get Together. Our episodes try to balance the enthusiasm and excitement about GLP and its associated intervention ideas, as well as a healthy dose of skepticism about how to understand and integrate this paradigm shift into your career and the field at large. We hope that you can get together with us to learn more about Gestalts.
Welcome to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, presented by SpeechTherapyPD.com. This podcast is designed for the adult medical speech-language pathologist. Most of our audience members work in settings such as acute care hospitals, private practice, outpatient hospital clinics, and inpatient rehabilitation hospitals. Each episode has an accompanying audio course on SpeechTherapyPD.com and is available for 0.1 ASHA CEUs. The content of this course is based on the research and experience of the presenters. The listener is responsible for researching to determine if the information and skills taught are appropriate for their clients, students, or patients. SpeechTherapyPD.com does not necessarily endorse, recommend, or favor the information shared, nor any of the claims, opinions, statements, offers, or services made by the presenter.
Hello, and welcome everyone. My name is Renee Garrett, and I am your Speech Therapy PD podcast host for Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. Before we get started, we have a few items to alert you to. Each episode is 60 minutes and will be offered for 0.1 ASHA CEU. Here are the financial and non-financial disclosures. Dawn Ducca receives an honorarium from Speech Therapy PD for her podcast appearance. Her non-financial disclosure is that she is a volunteer ambassador for the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. My financial disclosure is that I'm a paid employee of a private consulting firm in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and as the host of Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs, and other webinars on Speech Therapy PD, I do receive financial reimbursement. I'm also an adjunct instructor for both James Madison University and Old Dominion University. My non-financial disclosure is that I'm the secretary for the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia. Now, without further ado, we welcome our guest, Dawn Ducca. Dawn began volunteering with the AFTD in 2019. As the former primary caregiver for her husband before his untimely death in 2022, she's passionate about raising awareness and supporting others affected by this disease. Before joining the ambassador team in 2021, she raised awareness in her community through presentations. She actively participated in AFTD's annual flagship campaign, Food for Thought, as both a host and then liaison, supporting volunteers around the country with planning their events. As an ambassador covering the Southeast Michigan, Northern Indiana, and Northwest Ohio area, she continues to raise awareness, educate others, and be a voice for FTD, including ensuring FTD is represented in her local dementia-friendly community. Welcome, Dawn, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So I want to start just for those of you who are listening who may not be as familiar with frontotemporal degeneration, which is also referred to as frontotemporal dementia, that this is a group of diseases, brain disorders, that includes the degeneration of both frontal and temporal lobes of the brain. This is the most common form of dementia for people under the age of 60 and includes the variants of corticobasal syndrome, progressive supranuclear palsy, primary progressive aphasia, ALS and frontotemporal degeneration, as well as behavioral variant FTD. So I just wanted to kind of cover that so that you all are aware that we're starting to see this in our practice setting more and more frequently. I know for myself, I've had several patients with primary progressive aphasia, and we'll kind of talk about, Dawn and I will talk about that a little bit later. We'll kind of loop back into what we're talking about with these symptoms. But Dawn, can you share with us what signs and symptoms maybe you noticed, or did your husband notice he was having any symptoms? It's kind of a twofold, I guess, question.
In the beginning, no. He didn't really notice anything. I didn't really notice anything. He had just started a new position with one of the big three, and it was every 3 months he would change shifts. So we thought, okay, being in his 50s and going from a day shift to a midnight shift to a combination day midnight shift, he's not getting any younger. His body just can't handle it. And it's just taken him a little longer to get in a groove. It took us 2 years to get him diagnosed, and as things kind of progressed, he would have problems with everyday tasks at work. He had an extensive vocabulary, and we started noticing he just couldn't recall certain words. And again, like I said, just doing everyday tasks at work, working on a computer, he would have issues. Sometimes he would text me and say, "Okay, I know I should know how to do this. I'm putting together a PowerPoint presentation, but I can't remember how to do XYZ." Or when he would come home at night, he would say, I don't know why I'm not remembering how to do these things that he had done for years. And like I said, again, we just thought it was okay, it's a new job. He's older. We'll just see how things go. Started going to the doctor, could not find anything wrong with him. All of his tests, scans, everything came back showing no shrinkage in frontal lobes, nothing to give us any pause, anything to tell us that something was really wrong. I think we went through 4 or 5 neurologists within that 2-year time period. And being that he was not geriatric, we could not get him into anybody who was a specialist who would do a deeper dive to tell us if it was early onset Alzheimer's, FTD, or what the issue was. So that was a major hurdle for us, was just trying to get him to somebody who might even be able to diagnose him. We finally begged and pleaded to get into the University of Michigan's geriatric neurology group. And his neurologist had suggested us to see a speech pathologist and speech therapist and see if we could figure out what was going on. At that point, they thought it was either early onset Alzheimer's or FTD. We went to the speech therapist, and she had some pictures for him to look at. And the first picture was of a pair of scissors. And he looked at the picture and he said, "I know what that is, but I can't think of the name of it." And she said, "Well, what does it do?" And he said, "It cut." Did the hand motion, everything. And she said, "Scissors?" And he went, "Oh, that's it. Yep, you're right. It's scissors." And moved to the second picture, and he says, "That's a horrible picture." And she kind of giggled at the picture. It wasn't a great picture. And she says, "Okay, I'll give you that. It's not a great picture. What does it do?" And he says, "I do this with it." And she goes, "A toothbrush?" And he goes, "Oh, again, you're right." He goes, "It's a really bad picture, but yeah, that's what it is." Every picture he did that. And by the end of that appointment, she looked at me and she said, it's frontotemporal dementia, primary progressive aphasia. I'm telling you right now. And I said, "Well, how do you know that?" And she said, "Somebody with Alzheimer's, once you give them the word, they still can't recall it.
Mm-hmm.
But somebody with PPA, the word is there, they just can't access it." Then 3 days later, his brain scan, his MRI came back showing that he finally had shrinkage in his frontal lobe. But it started to progress with just small words that he couldn't remember. And, me being the good wife, or I was thinking the good wife at the time, would always want to give him the word. I didn't want to see him frustrated with not remembering what a word was, and would always fill in the word, which I've come to learn was not probably the best solution. But again, not knowing what we were dealing with, I wanted to help him remember the words and not feel that frustration. Because like I said, he had an extensive vocabulary, prided himself on his vocabulary and how he spoke. And it was a huge blow to him that he would forget words.
Yeah, and I think that 2-year time frames for some reason seems to be so pivotal for a lot of our patients. I had that as my last patient I had with primary progressive aphasia was not exact, but a very similar scenario. And that this was a guy who worked at a high level position for a really large, well-known company. He was retired upper level officer for the military. Very, very intelligent guy, family man, husband, had 2 sons. And he was experiencing very similar things, and we'll kind of delve into that in a minute. But that word finding piece was a big part of it at work. And so no one at work was talking about it. They were like, oh, he's just having a bad day, or maybe he didn't have coffee this morning, or, we'll just fill in the word for him. And they did that for about 2 years before his wife started figuring out it was trickling over into home. He kind of didn't say anything because he was afraid. He didn't want to look stupid. He didn't want people to think that he wasn't as smart as he once was, because he was also in his 50s. And it was really, to hear him before he lost a lot of his language describe it, it was devastating, because he felt such shame and guilt surrounding it when he didn't even have a diagnosis yet. So when you talk about daily tasks, so let's talk about both at home and at work. So you start with whichever one, because you mentioned that he was having trouble, like with maybe creating a PowerPoint. What are some other daily tasks that really became challenging for him?
Well, it came down to pretty much everything. We have a cat, and one day he called me at work, and he said, "I've changed the cat's underpants." And yeah, that was the exact look. Okay, trying to figure out what he meant. And I go, okay, I don't understand what you mean. What does changing the cat's underpants mean? I changed the cat's underpants. And finally I said, okay, can you take a picture of what you're talking about? And he took a picture of her litter box, and he sent me her litter box. I changed the cat's underpants.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, okay, you cleaned her litter box. Yes, I changed her underpants. And yeah, I learned, I always joked and said I learned to speak Jim. And it's like a puzzle. You have to figure out what they're talking about. Luckily, at that point, he could still use his phone and take pictures. We ran into a situation to where he would try to do those things again. He couldn't find something in the house, we have 2 children. And at the time they were 7 and 9 when we were starting our journey. And so he would be home with the kids during the day and getting them ready for school if I was gone to work, or if I had to run out and do something. And he would get frustrated because he just couldn't find certain things for the kids. And he said, I can't find, whatever the item was. They need it for school. And it got to a point to where he couldn't describe to me what room he was in or what he was seeing. And like I said, luckily at that point, he could still take pictures with his phone, and he would just take pictures of random things and send me what he was looking at. And I'd say, okay, here's what you're looking for. And I would send him the picture back, and I would write on the picture or circle what he was looking for. So he had that. That's what we ran into at home. Luckily, he never got lost, still knew where he was going. He did say quite often, I wish my brain was better. I just don't feel right. Started having a lot of panic attacks at work. And like I said, he worked for one of the big 3 in a plant, and they had on-site medical professionals there. And the doctor from the company called me and said, something's just not right. He's very anxious. We're noticing that he's just doing anything. He's really struggling. I really think you need to have him looked at, because he could lose his job, number one. And number 2, it's a safety issue, and we don't want him to get hurt. So it was a combination of things. Slowly losing the words as things went on. By the time he passed, he was completely nonverbal, could not say anything. It had been at least 2 years since he had said my name or any of our kids' names. He still somewhat recognized them. And you could say, like his sister Margaret, there's a picture of her on the wall. When she would call, I would go to the picture and I'd say, which one's Margaret? And he would walk over to the picture and he'd point to her. But he could not really verbalize anything to her. It was, like I said, it was it was word soup, just trying to figure out and speak Jim. So yeah, it was very painful, very painful.
I'm sure. I'm sure. And so, and thank you for sharing that and pointing out that it's painful, because I think it's helpful for people to know from a caregiver standpoint that it is hard, it is painful. And so thinking about, like, he was still driving at that point early on. Did
Yes.
he at some point stop driving?
Yes, it was actually pretty early on. It was probably a good year, maybe close to a year after he was finally got the diagnosis. I worked for our local school system at the time, and it was summertime, and our girls were in summer band, and he needed to drive them to the high school so they could go to their program. And I always built in extra time just so he didn't have to rush. He could take his time. The girls knew it. He thought he was running late, got in the car with them, and was driving and was speeding to get them to the high school and refused to pull over for the police until
Oh,
he got to our high school. And my girls were texting me once they got there. And I was in the building and they're texting me, they're going, "We think Dad's going to get arrested." And I'm like, "What? Where are you?" And they told me what side of the building they were on. So I went out and started talking to the police officer. And I said, he's newly diagnosed with, frontotemporal dementia. And she says, he wouldn't pull over for me. And she says, when I asked him why, he just kept saying, I knew I had to be somewhere. I knew I had to have my kids somewhere. I knew I couldn't be late. So I just wasn't going to stop until I got there because I didn't want the girls to be late. And she said, I'm going to put in to have him tested to see if he can still drive. And I said, absolutely no problem. She said, he cannot drive home right now. So we had to call somebody to come help get the car home. And he stopped driving right then and there. We went for the exam and he did the written part and he would have passed. But he second guessed himself on one question, changed the answer, and he missed passing by that one question.
oh, wow.
Otherwise he would have still been able to drive.
Technically, yeah.
And was very adamant for probably a good 2-3 years after that he didn't do anything wrong. He still could have been driving. I could still be driving. I don't understand why they had to pull me over. I said, well, you were speeding. You didn't comply. Well, that doesn't matter. Yeah, it does.
Well, and it's not funny, but I only kind of laugh, and it reminds me of my mother-in-law had Alzheimer's, and when she was still driving, there were several traffic incidents, and she had probably 6 or 7 accidents that we were aware of. Fender benders is what she would call them, and she kept saying that she didn't kill anyone and no one died, and we're like, oh, thank goodness, not yet. If you keep going. But she had done, several things, sideswiped the little yellow poles that sit to protect you from hitting the gas pumps. She sideswiped that. She sideswiped the same kind of yellow pole that sits in front of like Walmart to prevent you from driving into the door. She sideswiped someone on a bridge here locally and said that it was his fault because he came out of nowhere. And she was switching lanes and didn't look. So there were several things like that. And she was the same way. It was very hard to convince her that it wasn't just her safety, it was other people's safety. She hit the neighbor's mailbox going, like, there's an intersection coming onto their street, and you take a left-hand turn and the neighbor's mailbox is right there. But there's also a road that's a 2-lane road, and she was adamant that was not her, but they have a Ring doorbell that captured that it was indeed her. So we had several incidents like that, and she was someone though who, if she was at home by herself, like my father-in-law had gone out to the church usually, she knew where the keys were and she would sneak out. So she did quite a bit of that. So it is, some states I don't think go through the DMV for testing. They rely on the neurologist for the neurologist to say it's no longer safe for you to drive. But again, mentioning like you did, how difficult it can be to get in to see the neurologist
Mhm.
period, plus much less someone who is, there's different types of neurologists. Some are movement
Right.
disorder specialists and some are more of the neuro psych stuff. And it's hard to get in with that specialty sometimes. And so by the time you get in with that specialty, even with a diagnosis, to see the progression of the disease, you're talking 6 to 8 months down the road before you can even get an appointment. So
Right.
that's one of those things that's really, really challenging because it takes away a lot of the patient's independence and autonomy. Driving is something we all, we drive ourselves to work, we drive ourselves to the grocery store, drive your kids to wherever. So it is really impactful, I think, for patients, even if they do have a language-based disorder or a cognitive disorder, to have that taken away. So
Right. And he was in the prime of his life, in his mid, or no, he was early 50s, 51, 52. So yeah, to take it away at that point was exceptionally hard for him. I did hide the keys just to be safe, even like my extra set of keys for my car. And I always tried to downplay it of saying, you're so lucky you don't have to drive. You don't have to deal with everybody else on the road and being stuck in traffic and dealing with somebody cutting you off. I wish I didn't have to drive. And again, he'd always say, "Oh, it's crazy. I should still be able to drive. I just, let me drive." And we eventually donated his car. And by that point, all empathy and everything was gone. And
mhm.
just, he didn't care at that point. I stood in our driveway and cried. He just stood there stoic, stone cold. It didn't even phase him. Huh, whatever. And I'm bawling because, I knew what it meant, um,
Yeah,
even though he didn't.
yeah, yeah, I know. And my mother, I go back to my mother-in-law, bless her. She is, at first it was that loss of autonomy, and then it sort of, she sort of made a joke about it, and she would say, from that movie Driving Miss Daisy, she'd call my father-in-law the driver, and joking around. So she did have some sense of humor about it, but she was also at a point where physically it was no longer safe because she had some other things going on with diabetic neuropathy and stuff like that. But we also had suggested to my father-in-law maybe taking the battery out of the vehicle, and he didn't want to do that. But yeah, she snuck out one night and he was at church and went to McDonald's because she wanted a burger, and left the garage door open and the house unlocked. And they live in a safe area, but it doesn't matter anymore. People do what they do, and who knows if somebody had seen her leave and left all that open, and
Hmm.
all kinds of things could have happened. So I think that's just a really great example of a task that we think is so easy, but when it becomes a challenge, it's so important for us to be mindful as caregivers of what the safety aspect looks like. And it is hard, it's a loss.
Absolutely.
Um,
We ended up
so,
a security system in the house through our local cable company. So I still have it. So we could arm our front door where it would go off if he left. We had cameras in our living room, kitchen. Eventually, I put one in our bedroom just to make sure he was okay during the day when he could be home by himself. And we bought a tracking device that went on his keys. In the beginning, he was obsessed with having his house keys everywhere with him. They always had to be on him. If you had his house keys, he was losing his mind because those were his. Give them back. So it was Joybit was
mhm,
the device that was on it, and you could set a perimeter, and we could say, okay, he's allowed. It's okay if he's 50 feet outside of our house. But anything past that, it would send me a notice and say he has left his trusted area, and it would track him. And so we had that just in case he did try to be an escape artist and leave the house, not realizing. Luckily, he never did. He only walked away from us once. He thought I was his person, so if I left his line of sight, he would get very anxious, very nervous, and he would try to follow me. We had a camper at a seasonal campsite, and we went there and we didn't have any food in the camper. So, and my dad camped right next door to us. So I told Jim, I said, "You're going to stay here. We're going to run. We're going to get food. We'll be back in like 10 minutes." We left. He said, okay, I got it. No problem. We left, went to get food, came back, and he was gone. He
Wow.
thought that we were heading home. So he started walking. If anybody is familiar with Michigan at all, US 12, which is Michigan Ave, is a major road here for us. And our camper was right off of that road, and we live off that road. So he was walking down US 12. We were a good 20 miles away, I think, at least from our house, and was just walking down the street trying to get back home. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, the camper was sold shortly after that. I refused to go anymore after that. I couldn't fathom him doing that again. And yeah, he was not left alone again after that.
Yeah, and it really speaks again to quality of life, not just for him, but for you all as a family, because most of the time, if you're going up there with your kids and you said your dad is right there, you're doing some family events, and it's probably part of your leisure time. And when that's impacted, that's a huge piece for quality of life for everyone. Yeah. Mm. And again, I kind of want to circle back and go back. You mentioned some safety things at work. At what point did he stop working? I'm trying to remember if you mentioned.
The day he got the diagnosis. So the
Okay.
neurologist called me and said, it is confirmed it's frontotemporal dementia. He needs to stop working now. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, with what he does, he was a dock supervisor for one of the big three. So there was tractor trailers, high-low drivers, constantly in and out of his area. He said, for what he does for a living, it is not safe for him to be in that plant. You really don't want to risk his safety. He was working that day. He came home and I told him, I said, we know what it is and you have to stop working. And he got very angry at me and said, in no uncertain terms am I stopping working. And I said, but you are. So I had to be the one to reach out to the doctor at the plant and say, this is what it is. What do I do to start the disability process for him? Because he thinks he can still work. And he said, no, he definitely needs to go on disability. If something were to happen, that would not be good. And he immediately went on disability.
Yeah, and that often is a process and a journey because it starts with the short-term disability and then hopefully goes into more of the long-term situation. But one thing people don't realize is that's a process, and this happens once you get the diagnosis. It's even if you've noticed symptoms over a period of time, the diagnosis is sort of like that click that makes everything start to go into motion. And so,
Right.
were you all prepared financially? Because usually it's a pretty significant difference between someone's income and what they're getting for disability.
We were not. And I was working, like I said, I was working at the time at our local public school. I didn't make anything. It was crazy the small amount that I was making. No, we weren't in any way, shape, or form prepared. Luckily, the process went quickly for us to where we did get the short-term disability and eventually long-term disability. We did get that set up rather quickly. We were lucky for that. But for me, there's a 12-year age difference between Jim and I. I am 12 years younger than him. So I am just now 51. So at the time, I was if he was 50s, I was in my mid to late 30s. Um, I didn't know how to navigate everything. I didn't know how to deal with Social Security. I didn't know how to deal with setting him up with the Medicare plan. I didn't know what to choose. I didn't know what questions to ask. I didn't know any of that. So no, we were not prepared in any way, shape, or form, and kind of winged it until we could get things figured out. I immediately started looking for a different job. I knew that if something were to happen to him in the short term, that there was no way that I could take care of our children. I couldn't pay the mortgage on what I was making. So I knew everything had to change, but it was very daunting to figure all of that out, keep our kids happy, keep him safe, and still try to move on as as life does, because life didn't stop when it happened. We had to keep going. I had to keep making sure that the light bill was paid. There was food in the refrigerator, the laundry was done, and that everything was still taken care of, just as it had been before he was diagnosed.
Yeah, and that often it is sudden, for any type of diagnosis, anything like this, it happens pretty quickly, and most people are not prepared. And even if you're not, like you said, you did a lot of winging it, but were there any resources that you were able to access, or did anyone in particular try to connect you to any resources?
At that time, no. We had a social worker for a brief instance. She helped me make sure that we had all the diagnosis paperwork to get him set up with his short-term and long-term disability. She ended up leaving the University of Michigan, and we were never assigned another one. I tried getting another social worker and did not have any luck getting another social worker. So it was just trial and error. At that point, I hadn't heard of the AFTD yet. It was all very new. And quite frankly, until he was diagnosed, I had never heard of FTD.
Mhm.
I would always joke when I would say, I was thinking FTD, is this like something to do with the flower company? What is this?
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness. Yeah.
I had never heard of it. And there there was some information on it, but the way it was treated for us was just start getting things in order, start getting your POA. This is not curable. There is nothing out there that will treat this at this time. You're just a ticking time bomb. We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know how it's going to progress. Just start planning for a future without him and dealing with all of that aspect, because there's nothing we can do. And that was honestly how it was treated with us. It was no resources, no nothing, no
Which
support
brings
group.
which brings me to, were you able to get any treatment from a speech language pathologist? And so we touched on that before we started this. So I want you to kind of delve into that.
I had asked for that and was told, and I think I can almost verbatim quote it, why? He's just going to lose it even if he learns it. So why bother? It's not worth it. Not going to retain it. There's no sense in doing it. And that was from his neurologist.
My goodness.
I did, being that I worked in the school, obviously we had speech therapists on site at the schools. And they gave me little tips and tricks, and it said, maybe try and do like a book for him of pictures to where he could point
Mhm.
it. He was losing words, but he still knew what he wanted. He could still point to different things of what he wanted. He could still, at that point, be self-sufficient enough to where he couldn't cook, but if I had sandwiches made for him, something that he could just pick up out of the refrigerator and eat or drink, he could do that. But don't ask him to actually cook anything because, number one, I didn't want the fire hazard. And he never tried. He just pretty much stopped and was like, okay, this is my little cubby in the refrigerator. I know that's where I go to get my food. So we weren't at the point to where he needed that extreme measure of point to what kind of food you want.
Mhm.
They did tell me limit choices. So as we were trying to figure out dinner, and I'd say, well, do you want this or that? And he'd kind of give you the deer in the headlight look of, okay, you're overwhelming me with too much. So we limited what he had to choose from. But no, we did not have any concrete anything. I'm trying to remember, towards the end of his life, he had issues swallowing.
Mhm.
Trying to remember, I want to say it was a speech therapist that came to try and help him with, or was it, no, it wasn't occupational. She came and tried to help him with his swallowing, but that was literally 2 months before he passed away.
Wow. Yeah, because a lot of the stuff is about maintenance when it comes to treatment, and trying to preserve as much as we can for as long as we can. And usually where I start is like a priority vocabulary list, because the some of the patients retain their ability to read and decode those simple things like people's names. places they enjoy going, like you mentioned, foods, restaurants. And so the pictures, there's nothing wrong with that. But again, sometimes those are overwhelming and it depends on how many you give them to choose from. So that was an excellent point of not only providing forced choice verbally, but then also with if you had to resort to using pictures. It's so crazy to me to think that so many people are out there and don't have access to therapy because it's the same story. It's, oh, my neurologist said, well, I'll write you a referral, but I'm not holding hope for anything to come of it. I got that quite a few times. And I'm like, well, thanks for letting me know I suck and I don't know what I'm doing. Cause that's
Right.
gotta, I don't want to take it too personally, but at the same time, I'm like, I can at least try to help and at least provide support, resources, education. What do you need? What do your kids need? There's so many avenues that we can go down as speech language pathologists to help not only treat the patient, but to support families and caregivers as well. So it's just so frustrating that we're still in 2024 having the same experience that you had, many years ago. Ultimately, how long was it from the time of his diagnosis until he passed in 22?
It was 8 years.
8 years. Okay. Yeah.
He passed, he was 61 when he passed.
Okay. Wow. Mm. So what are some things that if you were, because I know you do a lot of work with the AFTD, what are some things you think is important for other caregivers, family members, loved ones to know about this and what maybe, let's start there and then I'll ask my second question.
So there's a lot of things that I wish I would have done differently, not taking no for an answer. Like I really wish I would have pushed harder on the speech therapy. I should have, but at the same time, I didn't fully understand what was happening and I was working full time. I was taking classes in college, raising our 2 girls and taking care of him and everything in the house. Not that that's an excuse, but as a caregiver, I was overwhelmed with trying to
Mhm.
keep all the balls in the air and everybody's safe, everybody happy, everybody alive. So I wish I would have fought harder for that. I advocating for him, for us. We did everything on our own. We didn't really have any outside help. I didn't really know where to turn. So letting everybody know where to turn. Once I found AFTD, then I kind of started seeing, oh, well, I could have had, I could reach out to this person and there's this resource. And unfortunately for our situation, we were already kind of past, I don't want to say past the point of no return, but he was completely nonverbal at that point. We weren't going to get really any of that language back. Although he did surprise us once or twice with, um, he lost the ability to say hi. And a year before, I think it was a year before his death, we went to South Myrtle, North Myrtle Beach, one of the Myrtle beaches. And we were driving in the car, and he would always look back at our kids, and he looked back at one of our daughters and smiled at her, and she went, "Hi, Dad," and he went, "Hi," and we just lost it in the car because he hadn't said the word
Oh,
"hi" in years. And she said, "Mom, did you hear that?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "See if he'll say it again. This time, record it." So she did. He looked at her and she said, "Hi, Dad," and he said hi back to her, and she recorded it.
how
Which,
special.
yes, I'm thankful we did because I didn't have the foresight to record anything back when he was verbal.
Hmm.
Another thing that I regret not getting his voice, not getting him talking more. We do have a couple videos here and there that were pre-diagnosis that we hear his voice, but we took pictures each year of our family, but we didn't have anything to kind of show his progress of how he was losing his language. I wish I would have done that because when somebody asks me, like when you asked me, I could say, well, here you go. Here's kind of the progression, and would
Hmm.
have those recordings if it would help somebody down the road. And I know everybody's different in how they progress with the disease, but if it would help figure out different tools, different tips for caregivers on, okay, they're at this stage to where they're choosing wrong words for everything, or he lost the ability to read, he couldn't write, all those things. If it would have helped somebody now, I wish I would have had all of that. And I that's one thing that bothers me, that I didn't document all those things, thinking that maybe a game plan, you know, I could have brought it to you and said, can you help us with at AFTD with some type of a tip, like I said, tip, tricks, something to help caregivers navigate this, because it's not easy. You're watching a piece of your loved one in essence die every day.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets very overwhelming, and you tend to focus on what you've lost versus what's still there. So being able to come up with different things to help caregivers remember that, don't focus on what you've lost or what your loved one has lost, but focus on what's still there, giving them that quality of life. They're still there. They're still a part of your family. That's the biggest things that I wish I would have done differently, and that I would advise any caregiver to do. Don't focus on what's lost. Live with them where they're at. Do those recordings. And like I said, advocate, 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 advocate. Do not take no. If that neurologist is not listening to you, look at finding another one. The only problem with that is as you alluded to earlier, stated earlier, is that there are only certain specialists within this skill set. And I mean, even though we're here right next to Ann Arbor, Michigan, there was not a lot of people who specialized in FTD. There is now, but back when we were starting our journey, you couldn't get your foot in the door because he wasn't geriatric. So it's a catch 22. The biggest piece is advocate, 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 advocate. I can't say it enough. Advocate.
Well, and
it's huge.
It is huge. And, people hear advocate and I think they think grand, on the grand scale. But you made a good point of saying that it doesn't, we're not talking, if you want to be that person who goes and advocates for state and national legislature, yes, do that. But just to advocate for more resources, access to therapy, because therapy can be not just rehabilitative, meaning we want the person to get back to where they were. For this diagnosis, it would be habilitative, trying to keep them where they are for as long as possible while arming you as a family with the tools that you need to be successful. So it just irritates me to no end that you had that experience. But what, if anything, did you do to try to find support for you, or did you just power through until because caregiver burnout and caregiver stress is such a big thing that's talked about right now, and we again need to be looking at the elephant in the room, right? Because this is not a one size fits all, and it's not an easy task to take on to be a primary caregiver for someone.
Honestly, I powered through most of it. We had a hard time because of his age, even finding local nursing homes who would do respite care for him. I was able to take him one time. I had to go on a business trip, and we toured the facility ahead of time. I took him with me. At that point, he was nonverbal, but he was making loud noises constantly from the time he woke up to the time he went to bed. It did not stop. And I wanted them to hear what he was like. I didn't want it to be a surprise. I wanted to be very upfront and honest that this is where he was at. If you talked to him and tried to guide him, he would listen to you. He would do whatever you wanted. We were very lucky that he did not have any of the behavior issues. He was not aggressive. No matter how hard somebody would try to provoke him, he wouldn't do it. He went to the respite one time, and I kept calling saying, how's he doing? They're like, oh, he's doing great. We love him. He's such a sweet man. Went and picked him up. And what struck me about this disease is when I went to pick him up, he was the youngest person in the locked down part of the facility.
Mhm.
Everybody else was just hovered around the TV. He was nowhere to be found. They had said he just kind of would walk around, and it was another resident who was there who was like, "Oh, you looking for that young guy? He's just kind of out walking around." They just let him walk around. So I kind of had to go and find him. Tried putting him in the same facility a second time for another business meeting, and they refused to take him. They said, we can't handle him." So that was the end of that. I
Mm.
could not find any facility that would take somebody who at that point, that was, I think 2, 3 years before he died. So he would have been late 58, 59 in that. And physically, if you saw him and he wasn't making noises, you'd have no idea there was anything wrong with him. He looked
Mhm.
exactly like he did. If we would go out to dinner, most people would look to him, being, the man in the family. They would look to him, and he would just kind of look at me like, I don't know what to do. And so we would have to deal with that as well. But physically, you could tell there was nothing. You could not tell there was anything wrong with him. So we actually just didn't do anything. One thing that was shocking was all of our friends, we were very involved in our community, in our church. Everybody dropped off the face of the earth. There was nobody that was knocking on our door saying, "We're here to help." It just got to a point where I just did it myself and kind of ran myself into the ground. But I would have done it again. I would do it again. It For him, I would have done it 50 more years if it meant um, just having him here. We did keep him at home the whole time. He did not go into any facility. I'm thankful that we didn't, because it would have been right at the time of COVID, and I think he would have been very scared. We did try to get him into a psychiatric hospital to regulate medicine for him when he was verbalizing and making all the noises. And we were told, and this is another thing that, I mean, that bothers me to no end, and is another reason why I'm with AFTD. We were told he's not a danger to anybody or himself. We're not going to pay for it. That was the insurance company.
Oh
Yeah.
goodness.
Yes. Too bad, so sad. And at this point he was in the hospital, because at that point I was fine, to a point of maybe there's something wrong that I'm missing. I got real good at picking up the cues of if he was in pain, and is this a pain issue? Is this just him trying to verbalize and can't? Finally took him to one of our local emergency departments and said, I don't think there's anything physically wrong with him, but I'm at a point I don't know what to do. I'm exhausted. I help. I don't know what to do. And they did confirm nothing physically was wrong with them. They said, well, let's see if we can get the noises under control, and brought in a geriatric psychiatrist, if I remember correctly. Tried some different medications, tried to get him regulated, and that's when they wanted to put him in the psych hospital and regulate and figure out what medicines work for him. And the social worker of the hospital literally got in his face, tried to provoke him, and she said, I tried anything and everything that I could to provoke him to say he's now a danger to somebody. And she said he would not do it. And I said, no, you won't get him to. That's just not who he is. And she says, well, we've gone as far as we can go. Are you comfortable taking him home?
Oh gosh.
And I said, well, yeah, I'm gonna have to be. If he stays, he was relatively quiet. I said, if he stays like this, yes, it'll be fine. And it lasted maybe a month and a half, and the noises started creeping back in. We tried different medicines. Nothing really helped, until he just got to a point to where he just stopped all noises, all communication, everything. Um, and he got COVID in January of 2022. And we brought in a home health care worker. She gave him COVID. Uh,
Oh.
Not to laugh about that, but she came in, and she took her mask off. He would normally be in our bedroom laying down. So she would take her mask off as she was sitting by herself in our living room. He made a move to get up. She went rushing in to help him, forgot to put her mask on, and called us the next day and said, I'm so sorry, I tested positive for COVID. And he got it, gave it to me, and we keep the hospital just to make sure since he couldn't talk, he couldn't tell us what was going on. We did, luckily the hospital said, yes, we really should keep him. We'll make sure that he doesn't go, I don't want to say doesn't go south, but does not have any major complications. And that's when he started having the swallowing issues, is when he got COVID.
Wow.
So there was a lot of caregiver burnout. I wish I would have asked for more help. But there were times when I did ask for help. And like I said, we were very deeply involved throughout our community. And even though I would say, you know, we need help, there was none. And all of his family lived in New Jersey. He was from New Jersey, and we were here. So there just wasn't anybody. My dad lives close to us, but he has diabetic neuropathy like your mother-in-law. He's battling cancer and has his own set of health issues. And he was the same as you were saying earlier about, you know, I can't clean him up. And he's like, I'll sit with them, but if something happens, I'm not, no, you need to come back. I don't care what you're doing. I don't care if you're at work, you need to come take care of that. So it just got to a point to where I just did it on my own. And
Wow.
you know, I knew he'd be safe. I knew how much love I had to give him in that instance. And yeah, I just did it.
Mm.
Sorry,
Wow.
that was a long, very convoluted of
No,
story,
it's a very real, and I think people need to hear that. Are you comfortable talking about the impact it had on your kids, or is that a no-fly zone?
nope, it doesn't. I will talk about anything. Not it had a huge impact on my girls. So Jim passed away. He made it through. I shouldn't say he made it through. He was alive for our oldest daughter's graduation. And I always had, and they're a year and a half apart. So I always had it in my brain of, we just need to get through the second daughter graduating. I know he would want to be a part of that. He went to graduation. I had said, you know, even with the FTD, he's going to graduation. We went to graduation, sat kind of off to the side so he would be comfortable and not anxious being around so many people. He did wonderful with it. He passed away the night before our youngest daughter's senior prom.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah, missed her graduating by 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and his passing kind of came out of the blue for us. He literally was fine one day, and the next day he just wasn't himself, and ended up passing from aspiration pneumonia and FTD. It was the combination. Neither of my girls, they're now 20 and 22. Neither of my girls can drive. He was the one that was going to teach them how to drive. He had the patience of a saint. And he said, okay, you deal with all the girl things. I will teach them to drive. And in the beginning, when he got his diagnosis and that, and I looked at him and I said, you'll do anything to get out of teaching these girls how to drive. And we kind of made, you know, a little laughing joke of it. But I couldn't at that point with our youngest, I couldn't leave him in the house by himself. He was making noises, so I couldn't put him in the car to take either of our girls out and try and drive with them. So it didn't happen. It was very hard to, if they needed haircuts or different things, it was very hard to take them to those sorts of things because there was nobody to sit with Jim. So they were kind of put on the back burner for a long time. They understood why, but I still feel very guilty with that fact that you know, as people were going out and doing things as families and doing things, you know, daddy-daughter things, our girls didn't get to do that because their dad was sick. And for a long time. And they watched all of that unfold before their eyes. Our youngest, when she graduated, she wore his wedding band. And she carried that with her and had it on her finger when she graduated. So he was with her. And yeah, I had told her, I said, okay, now it's big on you. Make sure you put it on her finger. that it will not come off, because if it comes off, I'm not going to be happy. And she, and I would giggle, and she'd say, I know. She said, I'm going to guard it with my life. And I'm like, if you lose it, you lose it, but if you cannot, please try not to, because, and then not realizing at that point, he had 2 wedding bands. So if she would have lost that one, we still would have had the other one. But it was so early on. It was like, it's a piece of him. Please don't lose it.
Yeah.
And then just having to deal with his celebration of life, and, and be there for that. We did have him cremated. So there's a daily reminder as they walk by his urn, the first holidays, and missing Father's Day, which was right after he passed in May of 2022. So, it was graduation, and then it was Father's Day, and then we went into July, which was our oldest daughter's birthday, and he had a son from a previous marriage. His birthday was in July, and then Jim's birthday was in August, and then our anniversary was in September. So it was, and then my birthday's in October, and then you've got
Gosh, the holidays.
Yeah. And we actually sat and went through each month, and there's one month of the year to where there's not like something going on that's significant to our family. And so now it's just trying to navigate what those days look like. The yearly anniversary of his passing, and how do we deal with that? And then, then it's the simple things of house maintenance. I had to replace my washing machine, and the guy says, where's your main shutoff valve for your water? And I went, I don't know.
Well, again, it seems like the simplest things, but it's just, life is lifing, right? And
Right.
if you haven't been someone who was, and I say that because there's a lot of people who aren't in these traditional roles of like husband, wife, or whatever you want to call it, even if it's wife, and there's still people who have different tasks that they take on, right? So like, I'm the one who cooks, my husband grills. That's a whole different, I don't eat that stuff, that meat stuff. So it's 2 different things. But if he had to come in here and make, baked spaghetti or whatever, lasagna, he would be like, I'll throw some noodles and some sauce in a bowl.
Right.
So I think that's a great, just a great example of things that we don't even think about. We need to have a plan in place for those things, because it's the unexpected. And I think you sharing this journey and what seems like such kind of simplistic things are real life stuff, right?
Yeah.
And having an organization now that you've been connected to with AFTD, for those other people who may need support organizations for various diagnoses, they are out there and they are willing to help, but it sometimes takes a journey for us, even as providers, but for family members and other caregivers to find these places. And so, man, that was a quickest hour of my life. I could talk to you for probably another 25 minutes about this.
Absolutely.
But I thank you so much, because I know this is probably not the easiest thing you'll do all week. And I really appreciate your candor. I appreciate the real life stuff, because that's the thing that we as professionals need to be mindful of in our practice. So thank you so much, Dawn, for joining us.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. I could talk all day about Jim and ways to make things better, because that's pretty much on his deathbed. I said to him, I will keep working. I will keep fighting, and I will help others in your honor. I don't want his death to be in vain and not mean anything. He was an amazing man, and I will carry it on forever.
Thank you. Thanks again, Dawn. We look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you.
Each episode comes with an accompanying audio course on speechtherapypd.com, available for a 0.1 ASHA CEU. And just for our listeners, get $20 off any subscription with promo code BRAINSTORMS20. SpeechTherapyPD.com is run by SLPs for SLPs. We've got the largest library of ASHA CEU eligible courses out there, adding fresh content every week. Remember, use Brainstorms20 to get $20 off access to over 1,000 courses for an entire year. Head over to SpeechTherapyPD.com for more information and start earning CEs today. Thanks for tuning in to Brainstorms, Functional Neuro Rehab for SLPs. And don't forget, SpeechTherapyPD.com is your go-to for all things ASHA CEUs. Your positive reviews and support mean the world to us. We'd love for you to drop us a quick review and hit that follow button.